wanted me to...
1420 NBC Sports Radio Tri-Cities.
They wanted me
to
head
coach. What do we talk about on
give the
Tri-City
questions before I could interview one of their players. Don't worry about it. I'll tell you about it some other time. I'm doing it.
But I've been silent too long. Thank God and Greyhound you're gone. Thank God and Greyhound you're gone.
Noon Monday.
That was, of course, the promo that we played after Butch Jones was fired as the Tennessee Volunteers coach, and Jason Emmert perhaps using some of that as motivation for his own political campaign. A man who is, if he was running for office, all the NASCAR fans, all the motorsports fans would vote for him there. So perhaps Mayor Daley in Chicago ought to get a little bit worried. It's Jerry Bonkowski, the right rev of speed, or as I like to call him, the right rev of rev, writing for NBCSports.com. And you know, it's the second straight race in the NASCAR circuit which has been described as a demolition derby. Now, maybe it isn't such a surprise at Daytona considering how the Daytona 500 went, Jerry Bonkowski, but were you at all surprised with all the wrecks that there were in that race Saturday night at Daytona?
Well, as I always like to say, it's Daytona, baby. That's the record, baby.
And you know, that's one of the things about Bristol that they're, the bull ring about a half mile. But one of the things that I've looked at is that, I mean, from an artistic value, these last 2 weeks, when there's more space, there's more time for the flying and sort of the wow, like we do on fireworks. What is this? And the excitement of seeing fender banging, if you will, instead of what happens, like pile-ups at Bristol instead. But I did want to ask, it's the second straight time it may be running in Daytona. The underdog wins. Erik Jones comes ahead. I believe Martin Truex Jr. coming out there. And I just want to say, what about Erik Jones here? Obviously now he has a space in the field, but can this guy be a player come playoff time, in your opinion?
Well, he's in the playoffs now. I mean, barring any unusual circumstances in the next several races, he makes the playoffs by winning at Daytona. Will he be a player in the playoffs? That remains to be seen. I mean, he's had a lot of close calls when it comes to winning up and prior to this past Saturday night's race. So he's been kind of knocking on the door. The question now is how much will this win give both he and his team confidence going forward in the playoffs? I mean, the playoffs are a whole different ballgame as opposed to the regular season. And, some people might say, well, he won a restrictor plate race and it was more of a race that was won by attrition rather than anything else. I don't always necessarily agree with that philosophy, but I think that for Jones to show that he is indeed a legitimate contender in the playoffs, I think that he has to go out and win at least another race before the playoffs come. Just to show that Daytona was not a fluke, and it wasn't a fluke in my mind. But there's a lot of naysayers in NASCAR, and they'll look at anything as a potential what's the word I'm looking for? Way to not give him credit for what he was due, that kind of thing. So.
Well, the other question I want to, Martin Truex Jr., is right there at the end, but, and that helps him out with points and all this, but are points at all even still relevant? I mean, I know you can say, well, you got all these playoff fields, and yeah, it's going to determine who finishes 16th or 15th, but who cares who makes that final spot of the playoffs, in my opinion, Jerry Bonkowski. To me, it's like the Seahawks making the NFL playoffs with the 7-9 record, and you knew they weren't going to win the Super Bowl. I mean, why are they in it in the first place? It's like, that 16th seeded team with a losing record in the NCAA tournament. Even if they do beat Virginia like Maryland, Baltimore County did, they're not going on to win a national championship. And so, do points still matter in your opinion?
Well, I disagree.
Okay.
I mean, I will say this. The the odds are against anyone really far, even winning the championship. If if they make the playoffs, let's say in the 13th through 16th position. But we have drivers who have advanced from the first round to the second round, even into the third round. Over the last few years. I mean, it's not been many, but I can't. I'm trying to remember. Was it Keselowski? I think was one of them. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I mean, there is a precedent there, and I think that the fact that you make the playoffs what you can make it to be. So I mean, even if you've had a rough season, up to that point, the playoffs is a whole brand new season, and you can do a lot of things. And I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say hypothetically Jimmy Johnson qualifies for the playoffs. Let's say he makes it in as let's say 13th or 14th. I'm just saying hypothetically. You're telling me that you're going to say Jimmy Johnson's going to be eliminated after the first round, even though he's had a rough season already? No, I mean, this is a 7-time champion. I mean, and he and Chad Knaus, they get their game up to its optimal level in the playoffs. So, I mean, yeah, the odds are not good for guys who are, let's say qualify 13th through 16th, but at the same time, there's always going to be a potential there's a possibility of a Cinderella story. So, I hold out hope for for the underdog to really go far. Kind of like Loyola this year in the men's basketball tournament.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people didn't give them a lot of chances, and they wound up getting pretty far. So I feel it's the same way in NASCAR too.
Jerry Bonkowski, by the way, joins us from Chicago, if you didn't know that, NBCSports.com. But so that's one of the reasons why Loyola is on the tip of his tongue and all this. I was trying to get Bob Newhart on the show, literally when they were on there. I thought that would be fun to, speaking of Loyola people. But anyway, that didn't pan out there. But hey, I did, though, it was a night race, and there was some, weather delays and all this, some extra laps, all that. But does NASCAR need more prime time races? I mean, I remember a few years ago when, after some rain delays, the Daytona 500 was on a Monday night. And I mean, there seemed to be more people watching that because it was primetime sports. I mean, just the conversation that you had, Daytona 500 on Monday night, than there was when it was running its traditional time of Sunday afternoon. Would you like to see more night races like this in, Charlotte, Daytona, Bristol?
I've been saying that for the last 15 years, Marky. I mean, I'm a big proponent of, not only prime time races, but midweek races as well, too. And I think that, if you had, let's say, maybe a Monday night race, periodically, maybe once a month or something like that, I think you'd see that, the interest, both, TV ratings as well as at track attendance would jump. And then, if you have a midweek race, I think the same thing as well, too. So I think if, as you look forward, going forward from here, I think there's really no harm in trying it. I know we've talked about this before in the past. I mean, I think that you may see an experiment at some point, maybe next year, maybe 2020, but I think that it's coming that NASCAR is going to have at least one, either a Monday night race or maybe a midweek race, just to see how it plays out. The question is, where will it be at? Where will it have the best chance to succeed? Would it be Daytona? Would it be Bristol? Could it be, Darlington? Could it be Talladega? Could it be, anywhere? I mean, you have to pick the right track, and it's oftentimes difficult to pick the right track because you have so many variables of how fans will react to a race. Will they tune in? Will they attend? That kind of thing. So I think that you're going to see it. It's just a matter of time. It could be, like I said, next year. It could be 2020, but I think it's coming.
Well, let me ask this. If I run the New Hampshire Speedway, the Darlington Speedway, speedways that have had a race taken away from them, I'm intrigued by this because I might be able to say, look, how about that midweek race, for me, and we'll do it on that Mother's or Father's Day weekend. Yeah, it's a quick turnaround for the drivers, don't get me wrong, but we won't be running on the holiday that you don't want to, but we'll, be getting this, and we'll get that race back. I'm thinking that if I owned those tracks, that's what I'd be telling and marketing to NASCAR. If I did, do you think I'd get anywhere, Jerry Bonkowski?
Well, with Darlington, probably not, because NASCAR owns, International Speedway Corporation owns Darlington. So that's, it's already an in-house track, if you will. New Hampshire, that's owned by Bruton Smith and Speedway Motorsports. You might have a little bit better chance, convincing them to do it there. But here's the thing. I think that the biggest mistake that could be made is to have a race on a Sunday and then have another race on a Wednesday, let's say, or hypothetically, or a Thursday of the same.
I could see that, sure.
There's just not a lot of time for teams to turn things around. Now, if you're talking about, let's say, maybe a Sunday, let's say in maybe Michigan, and then the Thursday afterward, let's say in Bristol or maybe Martinsville or somewhere like that, yeah, that's a pretty doable turnaround because it's relatively close to the Charlotte area where most of the teams are headquartered. But for you to say, or for anybody to say, well, let's have a race on Sunday and then another race on Thursday and then another race on the following Sunday, that's just impossible. There's no way to see that. I mean, ideally, what I would love to see is, maybe on what would be potentially an off weekend, well, what would become an off weekend, I should say, is if we see a race on a Sunday, then maybe a primetime Thursday night race, and then we have the following Sunday off, and we don't race until that following Sunday after that. So you've got a long stretch for fans, and for team members and drivers, and that take a little bit of vacation, if you will, after a primetime Thursday night or even a Wednesday night race. So it's doable. It's just a matter of how creative the NASCAR gets with the schedule, and what makes the most sense logistically, and what's going to make the most sense for the fans as well too. You can't ignore the fans. I mean, if the fans say we want to have a midnight or a midweek night race at Bristol, well then Bristol is the place you need to look at. I mean, if they say we want to do it at Martinsville, you look at Martinsville. If they say let's say maybe a Fontana, that might be a little bit more of a different ballgame because that's a whole different kind of market out there. But I think it can be done, and I think it will be done.
Okay, well, that's Jerry Bonkowski here, NBCSports.com. Yeah, I mentioned Darlington, and I mean, those are the two, New Hampshire and Darlington, are the racetracks that came to my mind. But it just seems to me that here I am in the Tri-Cities, but it always seems like when somebody has come from Darlington, they just want to tell you about it. And I don't necessarily get that from Charlotte or any of the other neighboring tracks. I mean, around here, yeah, I'm going to Bristol. I mean, we get that. But, I mean, from one of the neighboring tracks, one of the driving distance tracks around here, I always hear, yeah, we just came back from Darlington. I never heard that from Martinsville. I never heard that back in the day from North Wilkesboro. Certainly, I don't hear it from Charlotte, but that's where I go with Darlington. And I do think that a lot of people don't like that traditional racetrack has lost a race. But that's an old argument. I mean, all this. I do want to go and talk to you. You've written a column about the IndyCar race in Iowa last week. Last week, I guess last weekend. Depends if you believe the week begins today, then I guess it was last week. But James Hinchcliffe, here's a guy who didn't even qualify, as you write, for the Indianapolis 500, goes out and wins the Bull Ring of IndyCar, the Bristol of IndyCar, if you will. In addition to that, but tell us a little bit about the column that you wrote. Why was that so special for you, and why did that motivate you to write about Hinchcliffe?
Well, when you have had the history that Hinch has had in the Indy 500, what was it, 2015, he almost dies, in a practice crash there. He missed that race, and then, just because there was whatever you want to call the reasons for this year, he missed the Indy 500 because of performance. That's a pretty heavy weight to carry around on your shoulders, and Hinch is probably one of the most positive, happy-go-lucky, friendly, sunshine kind of guy there is in the sport, and people have flocked him, reporters flocked him. He's just one of the guys. He's like one of the guys you go up to have a beer with, and you could just kind of tell that failing to get to qualify for the 500 has just been an anchor around his and his team's neck, if you will, for the last since that happened. I mean, they've had some decent performances, but they've also had some pretty not so decent performances in the 4 or 5 races since then. So I think that him winning yesterday was kind of a surprise. At the same time, it's also a place where he won previously in the IndyCar Series 2 at Iowa. So, maybe it wasn't a surprise, but it was definitely a huge, huge, huge shot in the arm. And that's why I try to convey in my column that, it helps kind of put Indianapolis even more further back in the I'm sure people will be asking him about it next year when he goes to Indianapolis. But, at that point, they know what happened. They know what went wrong, and they're going to make sure, they're going to fix it and fix. Sam Schmidt, one of the co-owners of Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports, was on TV yesterday, and he was asked that same question. September 17th, let me rephrase that. Right now we're not preparing for Indianapolis, but as of September 17th, which is the day after the end of the season this year, that's when they start preparing for Indianapolis. So that tells you not just how dedicated and devoted this team is to making people forget about what happened this year, and what better Cinderella story would there be? And I mentioned that in my season column, than for him to miss the 500 this year and come back and win the 500 next year. Because if there's any guy that really deserves to win the 500, I would certainly put Hinchcliffe among the top 3, maybe top 5 drivers that deserves to win the 500 that haven't done so yet.
Well, you've got me thinking, and I'm going to go back to NASCAR. Look, you're talking to the Tri-Cities here, Jerry. You know that. But I'm thinking how Erik Jones, when he's struggling for legitimacy, this is his first victory. To be a real player, he's got to win another race. Well, what about that other race in Bristol then? How much legitimacy, if he could win that, would that give him? After all, Daytona and Bristol, known for wrecks, but Bristol's the bull ring and Daytona's the super speedway. If you can win on both of them, then you're a complete driver. And of course, now I mentioned that because, of course, winning in the 3/4-mile track in IndyCar was Hinchcliffe. And like you said, can he come back for Daytona next year? I know that you won't be able to come back on Friday, but I do look forward to when you can come back next week, Jerry Bonkowski. I've got the writer from the Richmond Post-Dispatch, Mike Baker, talking about what's going on with Virginia Tech. They lose a defensive back this morning. They're down 3 players on their defense in the offseason. Can Hokies contend next year or next season? We'll find out. Tri-City Sports Now.
More. You're looking for Crabtree View.